I'm going to be chatting about some work that we've been doing for quite some time now on riparian area delineation and using really this sort of functional approach to understanding riparian areas. And yeah, hopefully we can have some good discussion. And yeah, let's dive right into it. So really the motivation for this work is really I guess, grounded in the fact that riparian management is really critical for maintaining aquatic ecosystem and terrestrial ecosystem health. Um, yeah, most of you would know this very well, but ultimately, riparian areas are some of the more critical pieces of the landscape, and that interaction between riparian areas and the aquatic ecosystem is a really important feature that forestry can play a major role in. Most jurisdictions across Canada, the United States, and other places in the world use this sort of fixed width buffer approach to managing riparian areas. And there's a bunch of literature on this, and a bunch of studies have been conducted to look at fixed width buffers and how managing riparian areas in that context poses certain challenges, both from a forestry perspective as well as from an ecosystem perspective. And without diving into too much detail around some of those challenges, really a motivation is to, I guess, use information that we have available to us and using our understanding of the processes that are relevant for riparian areas to really improve our management and improve the way that we're looking at these unique features on the landscape. One of the challenges and one of the reasons why fixed width buffers are actually an implementable idea is understanding the variability in riparian areas across a very large region is super challenging. And I think historically, without the advent of things like, high resolution imagery or LiDAR data sets or other data sets that we have available to us now, it was really a management regime that could be implemented across a large geographic space. And defining riparian areas over large regions can be time prohibitive and computationally prohibitive as well. Recently, say in the last 10-ish years, we've been using much more advanced approaches from a spatial perspective to understand what's going on in the landscape. So anything from canopy height models that have been developed, really detailed topographic data sets that have been developed using LiDAR and other technologies. We have a lot more at our fingertips now, and computing is actually a lot easier now than it was, even 15 years ago. So with the advent of new technology and with the, availability of new data, we're able to apply robust approaches using our scientific understanding of what riparian areas should be looking like, and implement them over very large geographic regions. So that really that's the sort of basis for why we're doing what we're doing. So we're saying fixed width buffers are okay, but they don't really get at the nuance of spatial variability in riparian areas. We have new technology and new data sets that we can use to get a better understanding of what's actually going on the landscape. So why don't we try and do that? So that's what we did in this project. When we talk about riparian functions, there's a number of them, and they really serve as this sort of interaction or zone between a stream or an aquatic ecosystem and an upland terrestrial ecosystem. And they do things, various functions. And this one's really related. This diagram is really related to aquatic function. I'm not a bear biologist, but I do know bears like walking in riparian areas. But as it relates to the aquatic ecosystem, things like shade to manage the stream temperature, providing in-stream wood for fish habitat and channel morphology, providing food for fish and for other organisms, moderating what's actually going on from a nutrient cycling standpoint, providing stability to the stream channel. So all these different features that riparian areas provide are critically important to understand, but they all sort of vary within time and space as well. So understanding sort of this spatial variability is one of the key things that's sort of grounding us in the approach that we've used to conduct this modeling. So it's a bit of a busy slide, but if you just look at this top image that's identified as Rocky Mountains and foothills, here are 3 plots that are shown on the right. What these plots are showing is, and these are conceptual, so they're not really necessarily, they're grounded in an understanding, but they're conceptual plots. These aren't meant to be actual numbers, but ultimately distance from the stream channel is shown on the x-axis, and the relative effectiveness or cumulative effectiveness is shown on the y-axis. And if you envision a watershed here on the left, the origin of the watershed, or in these high elevation sort of, avalanche dominated sort of colluvial systems, would be our highest elevations. Then we move into what we call transport areas. So these portions of watersheds are moving a lot of sediment and debris through the system. A lot of water is generated from this area. And then we move down into these depositional areas, and which are really, we start to think about braided channels in large river systems, or where we see a lot of alluvial sediments, so those sort of cobble streams. The idea behind moving along this continuum is really important when we think about riparian areas, both from a function standpoint as well as a forest management standpoint. So those of you that spend a lot of time, laying out cut blocks as an example, you could envision, super small NCDs or streams that are really, ephemeral or very, very tiny. The function in that area is going to be fundamentally different from, a very large stream, as an example. So when we think about the functions, in those really high elevation areas, really the riparian area is providing things like litter, so food for insects or for fish, and shade to the channel itself. As we start to move down, now we're starting to recruit wood into the channel. So again, more energy is building in the system, and we can actually start to provide wood to the channel and provide some of the structure of stream channels. And then as we move down farther into the system, we start to see things like bank stability become really important. So healthy riparian areas providing that bank stability. Also wood and litter and shade also playing key roles. So when we're thinking about this from both a management standpoint and the role that riparian areas are playing, we can start to put our process knowledge to work for us to say, okay, what do we need to be accounting for at these various spatial scales? So acknowledging that the functions increase in complexity along a continuum is really important, and I'll walk through why that's important here in a sec. And then a lot of the FMAs in Alberta are also in these more boreal types of systems, so which are fundamentally different from these more topographically driven systems. Similar types of functions to in large part, but ultimately we rely much more on hydrologic connectivity. So as areas get connected, they start to generate more water and start to play a more major role in what's actually going on within the aquatic environment. So, bank stability might not be as critical as some of these more, peatland and wetland dominated systems are interacting with stream channels. But ultimately, we need to be accounting for this difference in sort of geographic region when we think about riparian function. So the type of information that we're using can be slightly different. When we look at riparian areas, on the left here, we have Rocky Mountains, or mountain environments, very steep, relatively speaking. Not all areas in mountain environments are very steep. But when we're conceptualizing this, we have fairly steep gradients between the upland environment and the riparian areas. We move into foothills, and those gradients start to shallow out or start to become less steep and less topographically dominated. And then, as I mentioned, as we move into the boreal plain, we've got a very different landscape that we're trying to consider. The riparian widths can change dramatically as we think about topographic setting or interactions with stream channels. And that's really what we're trying to get at when we're thinking about how to manage our riparian areas. How wide is it? And what are the relative contributions from the different zones that we're trying to look at? So with this sort of background, and happy to answer questions on this as well when we get into the Q&A section. With this sort of background, we can understand how things change spatially, and we can use very simple techniques to start to map it out. And one of the technique that we used for this project is really using a digital elevation model. So using a LiDAR-derived digital elevation model, so very high resolution, to do a number of different things. So the first step was really delineating stream channels. So the entire analysis is gets grounded on the stream channel being sort of the center point of the analysis. So we derived a raster or a grid of stream channels. And for each of those cells, we define contributing area. And contributing area can be used in a number of calculations. That's why we derived it. Then this work, if you could think of a watershed, and sorry I don't have diagrams on this, and this morning I was thinking about making some, but I didn't. So we derived this cost distance or this cost analysis that if you can envision a really steep slope moving away from a stream channel. So if I back up one slide, a really steep slope moving away from a stream channel, there's a very high cost for moving up that very steep slope. On the flip side, if you've got a very shallow slope, there's a very low cost moving away from the stream channel across that shallow slope. So it's a very simple sort of concept, but it's used in our calculations. So we're saying ultimately, if the slope is very steep, so the highest cost would be like a canyon. So a canyon would be a very high cost to move up that canyon wall, whereas a very low gradient sort of meandering system would have a very low cost. So then we created this cost distance raster, which is used in a bunch of calculations. We then calculate things like bankful width, stream gradient, and drainage density. These are all used as a cumulative sort of input to derive this composite index. And the reason why we use bankful width is it's a really good surrogate for stream, so for the energy or I guess the energy within the stream. So as we think about that conceptual diagram a couple slides ago, a really high elevation colluvial system is very small. The width is very small. It also has a very small contributing area relative to a much larger system down below. So the processes are different. Similarly with stream gradient and drainage density. So these three variables combined with contributing area and this cost surface ultimately provide us with the framework to build this riparian area. So we developed this index, which is normalized. So just from, we normalized it to have the same numbers that we're looking at across all of our areas. And then what we do is we do this aggregation of the data sets. So we aggregate all the information and we look at how they vary in terms of their representativeness across the landscape. We break it simply into percentiles, and I'll show you what that means in a second here. So using all of that information, here's two different outputs. One is shown here on the left is Rocky Mountains, and the other one's Boreal Plains. In the Rocky Mountain area, we can see here that the really dark line across the middle is basically the stream channel. So that's really highly connected to the riparian area, or really highly connected to the stream channel, sorry. The lighter blue line is what we're calling moderate connectivity. So that's an area around the stream channel, but not directly within that bankful width area. And then outside of that is our lower connectivity. And the percentiles that I mentioned in the previous slide, we basically can calibrate that number. So we can look at the landscape and say, okay, maybe it's the 75th percentile of all of our values that sort of falls within these three categories. And we can look at it based on imagery and based on, I'll show you some field work that we've done to say, okay, these are the right breakpoints to be using in these landscapes. So that's the number that we're calibrating when we're looking at the overall cost surface to say, okay, yeah, where do we think the riparian area should be? So it's not fully automated, but sort of guided by information that we know about the system. And then if you sort of look at a completely different system moving into more flat topography, you can see these areas extend quite a bit wider, and they cover a much larger area. So ultimately, they're very different systems, and we've tried our best to sort of calibrate the system without overfitting it to each individual stream, but to sort of calibrate these model outputs to represent what we think is going on at the landscape level. To do that, we've also implemented a field program. So we've had our awesome field crew. This was one of the field crews that was present out in the, so would have been up just west of Cochrane. And what that field crew was doing was looking at these riparian areas and collecting a bunch of information about where we saw breakpoints ultimately. So here we've got this is the same site, but we see a relatively small channel, so the streams may be 5 meters wide. We do see this very clear moving from a shrub, sort of relatively open floodplain into more sort of coniferous and some deciduous trees. And then we sort of move up the landscape. So here you can envision that we have a breakpoint at this transition zone. We then collected a bunch of this information and then compared it to how well we were doing from a modeling perspective. And in some cases we did quite well, in some cases we did quite poorly. And we tried to then use that information to further refine the modeling that we were conducting. So how do we interpret these results? So again, using this sort of conceptual diagram of what's going on. So again, we have the stream channel. In our previous slide where we had those images, we had this sort of floodplain area. So we go from very highly connected to moderately connected within the floodplain into the upland environment, which is somewhat connected, but not necessarily directly connected. So each system is somewhat different, but we can sort of start to think about all the different roles that these areas are playing and start to think about how we might want to use this information to guide our management. And broadly speaking, we might want to consider things like, zones 1 and 2, so these very connected areas as things like reserve zones, and zone number 3 as like a management zone or something similar. You can see in this example here, there is quite a bit of spatial variability in this output. So if you get where my mouse is right now, that might be, I don't know the numbers, but say that's 50 meters. If you move upstream where it's a bit more, the channel's a bit wider and a bit more braided, we could be into 150 meters. Similarly, if we have a very steep canyon section, it might be a 10-meter area, whereas it's a very wide floodplain, could be up to 1 kilometer. So things that we're trying to account for when we're looking at this information. One thing we did to help disseminate some of this work, because this was a free project, was build just a simple web tool that steps through the general process. Hopefully you guys can still see this. This is just a simple web tool that's publicly available, but it could be used to sort of look at what the outputs might look like in certain areas and start to step through some of the methods that were used. So I'm not going to walk through this in a ton of detail, but ultimately it just helps disseminate some of the information and provide some examples of some of the model outputs. It's a very simple tool, but again, we can sort of step through each of the steps, I guess, sort of like a story map idea. And you get a general understanding of what the outputs are. Then at the end, you can sort of zoom into certain areas and look at the outputs as an example, and sort of zoom around. So that's all this tool is meant to do. But then similarly, all of the information has been provided to West Fraser so they can integrate the information into their planning processes or other processes that they want to apply it in. And we are working actively to refine some of the model outputs as well right now. Yeah, here's a good example of sort of maybe a steeper, more canyony type of a section. You can see some cut blocks around there. You can see how well the current riparian management has been applied, and how that relates to maybe what the model output is. You can do those types of comparisons as well. Then that is all I wanted to talk about in this part of the presentation.